In April of 2023, the beer giant Anheuser-Busch sponsored the popular transgender influencer Dylan Mulvaney, paying her to promote their Bud Light beer. This caused a large backlash from a large portion of Bud Light's conservative-leaning customer base. In an attempt to stop the bleeding, Anheuser-Busch put out a more traditional commercial, showing a horse trotting through various American landscapes. But the damage was already done. It is estimated that in 2023, right-wing boycotts cost Anheuser-Busch $1 billion in lost sales. This entire affair begs two questions. Firstly, why do brands like Bud Light feel the need to get involved in social issues? And secondly, why do so many consumers care? Regardless of what you think about Dylan Mulvaney, there's no logical reason why this should impact your decision to buy Bud Light. Before and after the controversy, Bud Light is still the exact same beer, being sold at the exact same price. And it's not just Bud Light. Today, it's very common for big brands to incorporate social and cultural messaging into their advertisements. It's not uncommon that you could watch an entire commercial and not even know what they're advertising until the very end. The product itself seems to have only secondary importance compared to the social or cultural message they're trying to convey. But this wasn't always the case. For example, look at this Coca-Cola advertisement from the late 1800s. It explains that you should buy Coke because it is delicious, refreshing, relieves fatigue, and only costs 3 cents. Compare this to a Pepsi commercial in 2017, which provides zero information about what Pepsi is or why you should drink it. It instead tries to evoke an emotional response from the viewer by inserting itself into the social justice debate. The evolution from purely informative to emotional advertising was no coincidence. This pivotal shift can be largely attributed to Edward Bernays, the father of public relations. Bernays pioneered the use of psychological techniques and propaganda to influence consumer behavior, transforming advertising into a tool for shaping public opinion and desires. His innovative methods laid the groundwork for modern marketing strategies, making him a key architect of the consumerist culture that prevails today. In this video, we explore the philosophy of Edward Bernays and how his ideas continue to resonate across the advertising industry. Edward Bernays was born in Vienna, Austria in 1891, but his family moved to New York when he was still a child. Notably, Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. Freud is best known for his ideas about how subconscious thought and primal instincts can influence human behavior. Bernays was fascinated by his uncle's ideas, and this would eventually influence his own work. In 1914, the First World War broke out in Europe. The Great War would prove to be a pivotal event for Bernays. While public opinion in the US was generally favorable to the Allied powers, very few Americans wanted to get directly involved. After all, the war was happening on the other side of the world, and thus did not appear to be a threat. In 1916, US President Woodrow Wilson won re-election on an anti-war platform. Here you can see a pro-Wilson campaign truck advertising his accomplishments. One of the accomplishments was that he kept us out of the war. In 1917, Wilson changed his mind and declared war against the Central Powers. The reason for this change of heart is beyond the scope of this video. Now, Wilson found himself facing a PR disaster. For years, he had bragged about his skillful ability to keep America out of the bloody war raging on the other side of the Atlantic. Now, he was sending millions of Americans to fight in Europe. How can you justify such a massive flip-flop? In conjunction with his decision to enter the war, Wilson also created the Committee on Public Information, or CPI. The CPI was a propaganda machine meant to rally public support behind the war effort, convincing people to volunteer to join the military and invest in war bonds. One of the people CPI hired was a young Edward Bernays. The causes of the First World War and the motivations of the various belligerents are complicated and still debated by historians today. Trying to use facts and logic to justify the US involvement in the war would be difficult. So the CPI decided to dumb down the propaganda message to a narrative simple enough for anyone to understand. The Great War was an epic struggle between good and evil. The German army was depicted as cartoon caricatures of monsters, while the American war effort was portrayed as a noble effort to save freedom and democracy. The CPI commissioned propaganda films depicting alleged atrocities of the German army, most of which were either greatly exaggerated or outright fabrications. Everywhere you went, you could see posters portraying Germans as monsters. Every time you turned on the radio or opened the newspaper, you would read about the latest German atrocity, which may or may not have been fabricated. The important aspect of the propaganda narrative was that it was easy to understand and evoked strong emotions. The CPI's campaign performed beyond all expectations. Within just a few months, they had converted the majority of the US population from isolationists to fanatic supporters of this righteous war. Bernays, who helped mastermind many of the CPI's propaganda campaigns, was shocked at how effective they were. Bernays' experience with the CPI gave him a very low opinion of humanity. He believed that most people are dumb, irrational, and easy to manipulate. In fact, he believed that most people are incapable of making informed decisions on their own. In Bernays' mind, the most powerful people in society are not public figureheads or elected officials, but instead whoever produces the propaganda. In 1928, he wrote a book called Propaganda, where he explained, quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of," unquote. Bernays had no desire to be famous, no political ambitions, and rarely gave public interviews. Yet with his mastery of propaganda and deep understanding of human psychology, he would become one of the most influential men of the 20th century. After the end of World War I, Bernays realized the same types of propaganda techniques that he learned at the Committee of Public Information could also be applied to the private sector. In his 1928 book Propaganda, he explained, quote, "A single factory, potentially capable of supplying a whole continent with its particular product, cannot afford to wait until the public asks for its product. It must maintain constant touch, through advertising and propaganda, with the vast public, in order to assure itself the continuous demand which alone will make its costly plant profitable," unquote. Around this time, the Second Industrial Revolution was bearing its fruits, and consumer products were being produced in previously unimaginable quantities. Large consumer product companies need to find new ways to convince consumers to purchase their ever-expanding inventories of goods. Edward Bernays set up a consulting practice where he would help companies develop innovative marketing strategies. One of his most notable clients was a cigarette company called Lucky Strike, which hired Bernays in 1929. Their sales were lagging, and they wanted a new marketing campaign to turn things around. At the time, the vast majority of smokers were men. Smoking was viewed as a masculine activity. It was considered taboo for women to smoke, as female smoking was associated with promiscuity. Bernays saw a golden opportunity to change the narrative and quickly double Lucky Strike's consumer base. He was able to get in contact with a few high-class female socialites in New York City. He specifically chose young, independent-minded women who resented the patriarchy. Bernays suggested that they attend a highly publicized Easter Day parade and ostentatiously smoke cigarettes for everyone to see. Bernays arranged for various newspaper reporters to cover the parade. When asked for comments, the women explained that their cigarettes were torches of freedom, and this public display was to protest societal discrimination against women. If a man can smoke in public, why can't a woman? The story gained significant media attention, and Lucky Strike embraced this with their marketing campaigns. They released advertisements saying an ancient prejudice has been removed, and women are now free to smoke in public without feeling shame. This campaign was a huge success. Hundreds of thousands of women became smokers, causing Lucky Strike's sales to surge. The women involved in that fateful Easter parade thought that they were independent thinkers standing up against the patriarchy. In reality, they were pawns playing their assigned role in Bernays' propaganda campaign. Today, when you think of the classic American breakfast, chances are you think of bacon and eggs. But this was not always the case. Prior to the 1920s, most Americans ate a light breakfast, usually only consisting of toast and coffee. The Beech Nut Packing Company was one of the largest producers of bacon at the time. They hired Bernays to find a way to increase their sales. As it turned out, Bernays' consulting practice had a physician on its payroll. The physician said that having a heavy breakfast is better for your health than a light breakfast. The idea is that you lose energy throughout the night as you're not eating anything while you sleep. Therefore, you need to recharge your energy with a large breakfast. Bernays sent out letters to 5,000 physicians across the country, asking if they agreed with this assessment. 4,500 of them responded that they agreed. The company soon started marketing the health benefits of eating a hearty breakfast, specifically with bacon. Bacon sales surged. The classic American breakfast of eggs and bacon was established. While Bernays indeed got 4,500 physicians to agree that a hearty breakfast is healthy, there were no clinical trials or scientifically rigorous studies of any kind. The physicians in question were not necessarily nutritionists, and may not have been qualified to opine on the optimal breakfast. We also don't know the exact wording of the questionnaires he sent to the physicians. When giving a survey, it's often easy to get the answer you want by carefully manipulating the wording of the questions. Bernays' finding that a hearty breakfast is healthy was completely unscientific, but most people don't have the time or mental energy to critically question every claim they see on an advertisement. Nobody has the time to become an expert on everything, so we naturally defer to the experts for advice. This gives professionals like doctors a huge amount of implicit authority, as lay people have neither the knowledge nor confidence to question their recommendations. Bernays recognized this and was able to engineer a scientific finding that just so happened to benefit the bacon sales of his client. While Bernays was based in the United States, in no country was his influence felt more strongly than the small Central American country of Guatemala. In the 1950s, the United Fruit Company, or UFC, was the world's largest banana company by far. They owned massive banana plantations across South and Central America, including Guatemala. In 1950, Guatemala elected a left-wing president named Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz campaigned on a platform of land reform. Under the new land reform, the UFC would be forced to sell all of its uncultivated land to the government, for what the UFC believed to be a below-market rate. The land would then be given to local peasants. The UFC viewed this as an expropriation and was not at all happy. When their attempts to negotiate with the Arbenz government failed, the UFC decided that Arbenz had to go. So who do you think they hired to accomplish this goal? You guessed it, Edward Bernays. Bernays started a propaganda campaign portraying the Arbenz government as a dangerous communist regime controlled by the Soviet Union. He even produced a propaganda film called Why the Kremlin Hates Bananas. Bernays paid for prominent US journalists to fly to Guatemala. He introduced them to Arbenz's political opponents, who eagerly portrayed the president as an extremist. He insinuated that the Soviet Union could place missiles in Guatemala, which could reach the United States in a matter of minutes. In reality, President Arbenz had no ties to the Soviet Union, and wasn't even a communist. This was happening at the height of the Red Scare, and much of the US political establishment was paranoid about the expansion of communist influence. In such an environment, it was easy for Bernays to convince the Eisenhower administration that Arbenz was a threat. So in 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup to remove President Arbenz. They replaced him with Castillo Armas, a right-wing president who rescinded the land reform policies of his predecessor. The 1954 coup in Guatemala almost certainly would not have happened without the involvement of Bernays. Prior to Bernays' involvement, nobody in the US was really paying attention to Guatemala. So when he started his propaganda campaign, he completely controlled the narrative. The Guatemala affair is a testament to the immense power Bernays wielded. By manipulating the narrative and exploiting the pre-existing fear of communism, he had the power to topple governments. Edward Bernays died in 1995 at the age of 103 years old, but his influence can still be felt across the entire advertising industry today. That's why these days, most advertisements from Fortune 500 companies are trying to pull at your heartstrings or pretending to care about various social issues while telling you nothing about the product they're trying to sell. As Edward Bernays showed us 100 years ago, emotions can be far more powerful than facts. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about Edward Bernays? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.